everybody. I'm gonna go through some of these notes that I think would be important from that video that y'all just watched. We're gonna talk a little bit about that in class on Wednesday, April Fool's Day. But there are some things that I think we should do just to make sure that y'all get and that you have in sort of context from the video. And then the next video will be about ideology. I think if I were to separate this out into like three big topics, I would think about sort of the rise of Castro and the relationship between his sort of first and second and third in command, the relationship of the two brothers for sure, Raul and Fidel, and also sort of the beginnings of political purges and how that plays a pretty significant role in sort of Castro consolidating his power by in really the time span of a year. You remember the time frame we're talking about, January 1st, 1959. Batista has fled. They've taken over Havana, and they've taken over it pretty easily. Remember, we talked about this a little bit last time. It's almost like the army just said, here you go, right? We're not really going to sort of push against or put somebody else in position. And there, it was sort of these rebels. At the same time, the urban middle class was so pretty much sort of fed up with Batista that they were ready for something and a new regime. And so I think that's an important piece. I think you do see Castro emerge, obviously, as sort of a very charismatic leader. But remember, this really sort of funny period of 1959 to about 1961, he's not communist. He's a massive opportunist. He is, he's talking and using the media a ton, right? He's using the media to not only talk about sort of the very beginnings of his regime, about how it's peaceful and nonviolent, this is a peasant revolution, the white doves flapping in the air, but he doesn't really have an ideology, right? I think that's the piece that's missing here. You can say it's a peasant revolution. You can say that it's, peaceful. But what are you actually going to put in place? There's no legislative body. There's no Congress. And he gets increasingly more paranoid about who is on his side and who's not. And so, just like every revolution that we've sort of seen, is people purge within. They get really nervous. They get really sort of threatened by their own power, especially if they become sort of an autocratic ruler, because if it's only me, then it really has to only be me. And if I suspect you for doing something against me, then forget it, right? There are some reform programs about sort of they redistribute land, they take away U.S. property, things like that. And that's when people start to leave. That's probably one of the first waves of people leaving, and they're going to the U.S. Wealthy landlords who, again, it comes at the expense of sort of regulating rent or sort of providing for the poor, comes at the expense of somebody else. I think the person that sort of stands out here from the U.S. is Nixon, and I guess the CIA is not a person, but the CIA. Nixon doesn't trust Castro. He thinks he's an opportunist. He thinks Castro's lying when he comes to the U.S. and says, hey, I'm not a communist. He thinks that he really is. And he's not wrong. I mean, I think Castro sees the Soviet Union as being much more like amenable to Castro and sort of supporting his goals. And you have to remember the two other people who were super duper communist at this time are Raul, his younger brother, and Che, for sure. And I think, after sort of 59, when Eisenhower's like, are you into this? Are you not into this? And they stop sending aid is obviously when Cuba has to look somewhere else. Cuba can't jumpstart its economy on its own. It doesn't have the resources or the capital to do so. And so the only way to do it is to ask the next best thing, which is the Soviet Union. And the real fear, of course, is obviously Cuba as a Soviet outpost, which eventually they will become. Um, the Bay of Pigs, just like a big fat mess. We could talk about that more in class in Zoom. It just doesn't go well. It doesn't go well for the U.S. Because it doesn't go well for the U.S. It's a huge victory for Castro. I think the biggest thing about the Bay of Pigs, it's a pretty much a big failure for the U.S. Thousands of people will die, but that is sort of a turning point for Castro, where he now has become a legitimate ruler of Cuba. That his legitimacy and his role has now been recognized by the fact that they defeated the CIA and the U.S. Right? That's a huge deal. I think that's also when sort of major purges are going to start to happen. You're going to see sort of those anti-Castro rebels who are still in the mountains. You have to remember, Cuba wasn't a socialist sort of leaning state. They had been a pretty capitalist place, and they benefited from sort of neo-colonialist sort of U.S. policies, and in many cases they were pretty favorable to a U.S. style government and a U.S. style of economic policy. But that's going to change by 1961. Sort of that big sort of moment where they sort of all parade in the street, like every sort of like Soviet Cold War video maybe you've seen, of like people parading in the street. That's what they do, and they acknowledge themselves by 1961 as a communist state. I think the real question to sort of ask all of ourselves at that point by 1961, in May 1st, 1961, is what does that mean? He doesn't have an ideology. He doesn't have real sort of policy. And so all of that's going to come from a pretty radical left-wing component of Castro's sort of inner circle. We'll talk about ideology somewhat tomorrow, and then we'll talk more about it on Friday. Okay, see ya. Bye.